Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 25th, 1972, is the day in between 2 really big days in Edmund Muskie's political career. So Ed Muskie of Maine was a candidate in the 1972 Democratic Party. Not just a candidate, he had won the Iowa primary and was considered the favorite heading into the New Hampshire primary and beyond. And then 2 things happen in the run-up to the New Hampshire primary. On February 24th, an anonymous letter is published in the influential Manchester Union Leader newspaper, and it claims that Muskie had made disparaging remarks about Canadian Americans in his home state of Maine, referring to them as Canucks. This is what would come to be known as the Canuck letter that gets published. And then the second thing that happens is 2 days later, on February 26th, in what's come to be known as the crying speech, Muskie gives a speech outdoors in the New Hampshire snow where he rails against this anonymous letter, also claims that the publisher of the Union Leader had made disparaging comments about his wife. But the news reports of this speech, in many of them, they refer to Muskie as not just being angry, but emotional and crying, which becomes a bit of a controversy, and there's some interesting history to look into there. Before we get into it, I want to, just spoil the story and say that this actually genuinely hurt Muskie. He wins New Hampshire by much less than you would expect. The air is sort of going out of the balloon of his campaign. He collapses. McGovern and Humphrey start to win a bunch. Muskie drops out, less than 2 months later. And of course, McGovern goes on to win the nomination. He gets whacked by Nixon in the general election. That is a future show. We can get into that. But this incident here is one of my favorites. It's actually the one when I was conceiving of this show, thought this would be a perfect episode. So I'm glad we're doing it because it's got dirty tricks, controversy, media narrative, derogatory language about French Canadians. So here to discuss is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody. I'm so happy that we're finally doing your ideal episode.
Yeah. And you longtime hater of French Canadians, Niki. So
yes,
it's good
well
that you're
known
here
as
to represent that viewpoint.
Hater.
Yes. And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello to you, Kellie.
Hey there.
So Kellie, I want you to tell us what's in this letter.
Yeah.
First, I guess start with what is your sense of whether the word Canuck is actually slander and how we should think of that?
Well, not really. Not as we would think of other, sort of racialized slurs for sure. So a union leader gets this letter, this anonymous letter, rife with sort of childish penmanship and misspelled words. And it describes this conversation that is taking place about how could Muskie understand the Black community or what people in the Black community might actually want when there's so few Black people in the state of Maine. And, the joke is sort of that, well, we don't maybe have a lot of Black people, but we've got Canucks. And to which, Muskie is reported to have laughed at this particular joke. Canucks being a term that is used to describe Americans of French Canadian ancestry. And so this gets played up in a way where we're no longer talking about the needs of the Black community, and we're more so stuck on talking about this word Canucks used to describe people of French Canadian descent. So it really becomes much ado about nothing. And the real the real sort of story of this is how are you going to handle, the issues of the Black community gets completely dismissed.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point. Like, what are your policies going to look like? How are you going to make sense of the challenges in various communities that you don't have a ton of experience with? That gets lost in all of the foo-for-all over Canucks and this equation of Canucks with African Americans.
I mean, if this happened today, that would be the scandal, that this person sort of diminished the experience of Black Americans by saying, oh, yeah, but I have a certain kind of white people that we have to deal with in our state. And, right. And again, and so, just to be precise here, this is an anonymous letter that is sort of describing a conversation that Muskie was part of, where he like kind of laughs at the joke about Canucks. He doesn't actually necessarily use it. But, Niki, what do we know about this anonymous letter, where it comes from, how it gets published in the Union Leader, what exactly is going on, and then we can talk about the fallout.
The story has so many amazing plot points. Okay, so this anonymous letter was actually a dirty trick by the Nixon administration. So polling in 1971, in early 1972, showed that if Muskie won the Democratic primary, that at least in polls at that point, he would beat Richard Nixon. And so they're trying to find a way to damage Muskie's candidacy. So what they do is again, the dirty tricks are so dumb, but this one in particular, right? Like they write this misspelled letter. They send it to William Loeb, who's the head of the Manchester Union Leader. As you said, this is actually a really important conservative newspaper. Loeb is seen as a kind of kingmaker on the right because he runs the biggest newspaper in New Hampshire, which is an early primary state. He's deeply connected with the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And so, of course, the Nixon team can easily slip him this letter to put in his newspaper to damage a Democratic candidate. And it works. I mean, we should say, like, as dumb as this letter is, it does work.
That's what's absurd, how it takes traction and how it manages to undo someone's presidential aspirations.
And there's all sorts of sort of fascinating twists and turns and perversions in that as well. But on the letter itself, I mean, I really do think that this is very similar to Donald Trump in 2019 seeing Joe Biden as the front runner and saying, I got to go dig up some dirt and I'm going to call some people and apply some pressure and try and build up some scandal. This is very much along those lines. A lot of the Donald Trump dirty tricks playbook came from Nixon, both in inspiration and some of the actual characters,
some of the personnel, like Roger Stone.
yeah, exactly. But that is very much this playbook of just like, we're going to stir up some dirt. And, again, we have enablers in the media who we can use to do this. So let's turn now. So this letter gets published and there's a little bit of a brouhaha about, Muskie and saying something inappropriate, and it, sort of hits him. Now he gives this press conference 2 days later. Niki, let's do this. Let's talk about how the press conference was portrayed and how it came off, and then we'll talk about what we think actually happens at this press conference. So what is the story of this press conference that gets told?
All right, so there's one more little piece of Loeb chicanery that needs to be added in here, and that is that Loeb also publishes some disparaging comments about Muskie's wife. So by the time Muskie is getting on this stage on the 26th, he's pretty heated. He's not only mad about the Canuck thing, but the guy attacked his wife publicly. And so he's pretty hot when he gets on this stage. It's driving snow. It's a very snowy day. And he gets up there and he does angrily denounce these attacks against him. And that anger, his voice kind of cracks with his rage. And David Broder from the Washington Post, who's way in the back, is watching this. And he reports back that Muskie broke down crying, that 3 different times in the speech he burst into tears. And so this gets picked up as this idea that Muskie is actually maybe a little emotionally unstable and not fit for the presidency.
Does this press conference happen to be taking place outside of a landscaping company by any chance?
Interestingly enough.
Yeah, I just want everything to be a perfect parallel. But no. So yes, this storyline, Muskie is crying, not just emotional, but crying. Why, Kellie, do you think that is so sticky as the snow that is falling on that day in New Hampshire?
I mean, it just goes to show you how fragile everything is right now, how fragile campaigns are, but also how fragile we are in terms of our ideas about masculinity, because this belief that a man could be crying over something that feels a little bit like spoiled milk, albeit this is his wife's reputation. But at the same time, I don't think people could handle the fact that he was slightly broken or grossly offended by this. And so it led to his demise. He says, it changed people's minds about me. They were looking for a strong, steady man, and here I was, weak. And so that really becomes the end of his presidential run. He wins New Hampshire, but by a small margin. And it's really a mandate about what people feel like his capacity to lead.
Yeah, I want to stick with that for just a second, because what we're talking about here is potentially, we'll talk more about the other reports around this, but potentially this man crying after his wife has been attacked is such an unmanning moment that he is no longer fit to run the free world, that men have this like tiny range of emotions that they're allowed to express. And if they deviate too far from that, then they are no longer men. And in a time when you could only, mostly only men were running for president, they were no longer fit to run the country. It's it's a poisonous, pernicious idea.
It really is. Especially when you think about, I think people will permit in this moment men to cry like when their mother dies. But over name calling, I think people are a little bit like, hey, man up. Like this goes all within that moment.
Well, and the other interesting thing here is, generally speaking, a scandal sticks when it sort of reinforces an already existing notion of someone. But this isn't exactly that, because I think Muskie was seen as steady and steely-eyed and so forth, and this cut right against the idea of him. So I think it's a reminder that, these things are very complicated and this can play out. But I mean, I think it's also obviously playing into all these other larger gender norms. But, it makes you think like if Muskie had been seen as a very emotional softie and he had done this, would it have hurt him as much, or would it have reinforced people's fears about him? Is like a man crying in 1972 just going to be a bad thing regardless? Like, I don't know.
You gotta pull a John Boehner. You've got to be like crying all the time,
time. That's your MO.
It becomes part of your character.
Yeah.
But I think that goes back to like the idea of these. A lot of these campaigns are so fragile, meaning whenever there's a crack, it just gets exploited. Totally. And even if that crack is superficial, it doesn't matter. It can be enough to completely destroy someone's run.
Especially in a sort of media environment like this. And I know I make everything about a media story, but really this is a media story in the sense of like, you have all of this attention, right? I think people know what it's like in the week leading up to the New Hampshire primary. You're coming off of Iowa. The frontrunner now has a huge target on their back. The media is incentivized to find cracks in that armor. And when presented with this very sort of simple, sticky, visual thing of he cried, it just takes off. And you can do the forensics on how this like line, as you said, Niki, it gets written up by David Broder, but then the AP quotes the New York Times and then the Washington Post quotes it, and all of a sudden it's just showing up over and over and over, and very quickly just becomes accepted wisdom. Now, this brings us to the question. Niki, was he actually crying?
Look,
you were there.
I don't think so. I mean, I did not have a front seat to this particular moment in history, but there was a reporter who actually was right next to the stage, and he's watching it. He doesn't see Muskie crying. He sees him getting pelted with snow because, again, driving snowstorm. But when he reads these reports later on, I mean, his editor comes to him and is like, why? How did you miss this? And he's like, the guy wasn't crying. And so I think that there is both Muskie's own protestations and then the reporters who were nearest the stage were the ones least likely to report that he had been crying. It was the ones further back who attributed tears to Muskie. So I stand with the reporters at the front of the stage.
There is video floating around. No. I think it was snow. If only because I like little conspiracy twists. I just like the notion that it was snow.
No, I just feel bad for the poor guy. You do all of this for something that's allegedly not even true. It's
and that I think is another place where it's like there's a media game and a dirty tricks game being played here that we still continue to see, which is I'm going to provoke you to the moment that you break, and then I'm going to give you a hard time for breaking, right? And you see that over and over and over. And that's what happened
Britney
here.
Spears.
Yes, exactly. And this happened here. I mean, this editor was a longtime antagonist of Muskie's, going back into like into the 60s, and was just like always needling him, called him Moscow Muskie, was just like, and so it's like, why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? You have kids, Kellie, right? And then all of a sudden someone breaks it. It's like, oh, you're unreliable. And so, that's how dirty tricks work.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Doesn't the same thing happen in New Hampshire to Hillary Clinton? Doesn't she cry or choke up when they had asked her? And I can't even remember what the topic was now. And she got emotional. And then they're like, she's crying. She's crying. Right. Although I think that did lead to her victory in New Hampshire. So maybe it plays both ways. When women cry, it's like it's a tool of success. And when men cry, it's a tool for your downfall.
Yeah, this was a really important moment, actually, because Clinton had this reputation of being the ice queen, right? Like, this is another gendered way of attacking her. And after what surprised people, like her surprise loss in Iowa to Barack Obama, she shows up in New Hampshire, and her tears are reinforcing her message that she actually wants this, that she cares about it, that she is a real person, that she is authentic. And so it reinforces the message that her campaign wants to have out there. And of course, she's immediately like, oh, she manufactured her tears. Like, it's a no-win situation. But it was one of those moments where tears got a real look.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we talked about a bunch of scandals, and a lot of them actually do have sort of this core element of like when someone shows emotion, and whether it comes off as authentic or not. I mean, Dukakis on the tank was sort of a stunt, and that backfired for other reasons. But like the Dean scream, which we haven't talked about, but I've done a bunch of reporting on, and I just generally think was like way overblown. And again, that was a media narrative thing, and I don't know, like it just at some level, I think authenticity is the most important thing, and then you just hope for the best, and that your authenticity actually gets viewed as authentic, because I think Hillary Clinton probably was authentically moved in that moment. I think Muskie probably was authentically moved in this moment, and one didn't backfire and one did. And there's other moments where people try and fake authenticity or emotion, and it works and they get away with it, so like who knows. But I just think try and be authentic at the very least, and then we'll see. And try not to be a jerk reporter is the other part of the story.
I mean, if we can keep journalists over the barrel for one more moment.
Yes, please.
This video of Muskie crying is treated like the Zapruder film. Yeah. Like, they just keep rolling it back again and again to see, is it a snowflake? Is it a tear? As though it matters, which is something that still, what are we, like 40 years? It annoys me 40 years later.
Yeah.
God, 50 years later. Ugh.
Yeah.
Half century later, I'm annoyed.
If this annoys you a half century later, you should rethink your agreeing to do a history podcast where we go back and look at infuriating moments from the past.
My whole profession is just me being angry about things that happened in the past.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Mission accomplished for me to finally talk about the Muskie letter. I very much enjoyed this story. I even once to the two of you floated, maybe we should do it as two parts. But no, this worked well as one part. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody. And listeners, you can't see at home, but a single tear is trickling down Jody's cheek right now.
But it's snowing in here. I swear to God, the sunroof's open. It's snowing. Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
Thank you.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Follow us on social media, This Day Pod, where we are posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day. Get in touch with us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. We love hearing from listeners with questions, comments, suggestions for future topics. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
By attacking me, by attacking my wife, he has proved himself to be a gutless coward. Maybe I said all I should on it. It's fortunate for him he's not on this platform beside me.
Radiotopia.